At about 2 in the afternoon of the 22nd of July 1974, an unusual dogfight took place over the northern Aegean Sea. A pair of Greek F-5 freedom fighters engaged two Turkish F-102 Delta Daggers. Missiles were fired by both sides. At least one aircraft crashed. Even 50 years on, the exact outcome is the subject of endless debate and no little acrimony. In the summer of 1974, the tensions between Greece and Turkey were at least as high as they had been in 1964, when intervention from Lyndon Johnson had been necessary to prevent a war between two ostensible NATO allies. Turkish troops landed on Cyprus on the 20th of July. Aviators on both sides therefore spent the night of the 20th on an edgy alert, fully expecting to be called into action. But aside from Turkish pilots flying ground attack sorties, there were no clashes. Both sides remained firmly in airspace that was uncontestedly their own. That would change on the 21st and 22nd. Both sides flew reconnaissance sorties into the Aegean to assess each other's intentions. No one wanted to be caught out in a repeat of first strike tactics employed in the Middle East or South Asia. And since both sides depended on ground-based radars for early warning, there was a pressing need for visual and signals intelligence. On the 22nd of July, Greek radars were tracking multiple Turkish aircraft flights, and the ground controllers decided to scramble more fighters to monitor them. That task fell to the 337th Day Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 111th Fighter Wing based at Nea Anchialos, located on the coast about 250 kilometers north of Athens. The 337th flew the F-5A Freedom Fighter. The F-5 was the Greek Air Force's lead-in fighter trainer, used to prepare pilots for the even hotter F-104. Flight Lieutenant Dinopoulos and Flight Officer Skamparthonis were the alert pair. They had been sitting, strapped into their fighters for some time when the order to scramble came. They cranked their engines and rolled out of their shelters, but immediately encountered an issue. Via hand signals, Dinopoulos, the flight leader and an instructor in the squadron, informed his number two that he had a radio failure. Under normal circumstances, this would have led to a mission abort. But these weren't normal circumstances, so via hand signals, Skamparthonis was ordered to take the lead. A radio was obviously essential for communication with GCI, call sign Joker. Skamparthonis' account is the fullest of those available. The F-5s took off, carrying their standard load of a pair of AIM-9B sidewinders on wingtip rails and 280 rounds of 20mm ammunition for each of their two M39 cannons. They were under strict instructions to make a visual ID of the target they were intercepting. Master Arm was off. Now airborne, they started to climb and headed for the northern Aegean, under instructions from Joker, which was based at the Mount Pelion radar station. Skamparthonis took the lead, with Dinopoulos in trail some distance above him. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Aegean, two other fighter pilots were also taking off. Turkish radars detected a slow-moving target, presumed to be a Greek Albatros amphibian, that was jamming the radar site at Çanakkale. At 1:35, a pair of F-102 Delta Daggers of the 142nd Fighter Squadron were scrambled from Balıkesir to chase it off. Their pilots were Lieutenant Colonel Vasif Sayin and Captain Sitki Onur. The Delta Dagger, more commonly known as the Deuce, was a pure-play bomber interceptor. It had been designed in the late 1940s and early 1950s as a counter to anticipated Soviet jet bombers. It was a beautiful aircraft, but a disappointing one, being not as fast or as sophisticated as the US Air Defense Command had hoped. In 1968, as more advanced types arrived in US service, 19 single-seat and 5 two-seat aircraft were transferred to Greece, and around 50 went to Turkey to provide all-weather and night interception capabilities against Soviet aircraft seeking to access the Mediterranean. In the event of war, they would have provided important defensive cover to US missile bases and nuclear weapons deployed to Turkey and Greece, and they would have protected shipping. To effect its mission, the F-102 had a decent radar, and a sophisticated automated weapons queuing system, alongside an infrared search and track system that could be used to detect aircraft and direct the radar. For this assignment, the Deuces were loaded with 3 AIM-4A and 3 AIM-4D Falcon infrared homing missiles. The Deuce didn't have a gun. It could carry a dozen 2¾ inch folding fin aircraft rockets in the doors of the weapons bay. However, their presence or absence on the 22nd of July is irrelevant, as they were useless against another fighter. The weather in the northern Aegean on the early afternoon of July the 22nd, 1974, wasn't as stunning and clear as you might have expected. It was hazy and there were clouds at 10,000 feet. Whereas the Turkish flyers were able to locate the Albatross with their radar, the F-5 crews were being led on a bit of a merry dance by Joker, which changed their heading and altitude instructions 2 or 3 times during the early part of their mission. They were then ordered to head for an area between the islands of Agios Evstratios and Limnos at 20,000 feet. Skamparthonis was climbing through 18,000 feet at 350 knots of indicated airspeed when Joker suddenly told him to look out for bogies 20 degrees off his nose. As he directed his attention to this area, he saw 2 Turkish F-102s in a tight formation to his left, just 200 meters away from him and on a parallel course. They were traveling straight and level at about 500 knots. The Greeks were in a loose deuce with Dinopoulos in trail a mile back. This was inherently a superior formation to the interceptor patrol formation being flown by the Turkish fighters, and would become a factor a minute or so later. In terms of the aircraft, it's tempting to assume that the F-5 has the odds stacked in its favour when fighting an F-102. Although at the moment the engagement started, it likely weighed about 55% or so as much as the Deuce, the F-102 had more than double the engine power and afterburner, giving it a better thrust-to-weight ratio. The massive delta wing also resulted in half of the wing loading of the F-5, although its large area would be a disadvantage at lower speeds due to the braking effect at high angles of attack. The Deuce's real Achilles heel in a dogfight with a freedom fighter was the Falcon missile system, which was unsuitable for engaging a turning target, and the lack of a gun. The Deuce also had dreadful rearwards visibility and a large bar down the middle of the canopy, which blocked sight lines up and around the aircraft. The F-5 was armed with Sidewinder, which has a narrower effective envelope than the AIM-4D, but the critical advantage of a larger proximity-fused warhead. And it had the lethal M39 cannon and a radar-lead computing gun sight designed for engaging other fighters. Its bubble cockpit also gave it much better all-round visibility. Skamparthonis stopped his climb and broke hard left into the Deuces. The Turkish pilots also broke left, following him into the turn. Skamparthonis expected them to bug out east after one circle, but they did not. Instead, they followed him into another turn. After 3 or 4 circles, they were in the F-5's rear quarter. Skamparthonis was nose low, down below 300 knots, and the fight was at 10,000 feet. This point is where the Turkish and Greek stories diverge. According to the Greek account, Captain Onur, the Turkish number 2 pilot, now got a lock and fired a Falcon. The circumstances for a missile launch don't seem particularly ideal. Both aircraft were in a descending high G turn in afterburner, probably upwards of 5G given their airspeed. Being above the F-5, the F-102 was firing a Falcon with the sea as a backdrop, which was likely to confuse the seeker despite the afterburner plume to aim at. Lacking a proximity fuse, the Falcon needed to score a direct hit, which made the job of damaging a fighter in a turning fight even harder. In Vietnam, F-4D crews scored a dismal 9% probability of kill with their Falcons. In the Greek account, this missile goes wild. The Turkish account says that their pilots only fired when they saw a Sidewinder being launched at them by Dinopoulos. They then radioed their controllers for permission to fire. Receiving this, Captain Onur launched a Falcon. Onur and Sain reported seeing that missile impact with a bright flash that destroyed the F-5. The pilot ejected. Dinopoulos had thus far been unable to affect the engagement, principally because the F-102 pilot seemed to have been unaware of the second F-5. The F-102's visibility behind, as I said, was appalling, and they had taken the rather ill-advised choice of a close formation. It's debatable whether a different formation would have been better, as the wingman was unable to protect the leader's tail anyway because he himself couldn't see behind. They would have probably broken off, though, if they had known that they were actually in such a disadvantageous position. As the fight descended, Dinopoulos now found himself following the Turkish fighters as they, in turn, followed Scamparthonus. Although the manoeuvres were quite aggressive, rules of engagement meant that Dinopoulos wasn't in a position to intervene until he observed the missile launch. I can only imagine his frustration when he saw the F-102's missile bay open. He was unable to shout a warning. What he could now do, though, was flip the master arm. His next move should have been to wait until the characteristic growl of the Sidewinder seeker head detecting the hot exhaust ahead turned into the tone indicating a lock-on. If he were pulling 2G or less to track the target and was inside of a mile with positive delta Mach, then he was in the envelope and could fire effectively. In any case, Dinopoulos made a mess of his first shot. For some reason, he fired without a tone and the Sidewinder went ballistic. According to the Greek account, Dinopoulos then got another tone and fired the second missile. It hit the leading F-102 dead center, and he had to brake hard right in order to avoid being hit by the debris of the aircraft that was burning while crashing into the sea. Scamparthonus then said he saw a large splash as the F-102 hit the sea and he observed an oil slick. In executing the evasive maneuver, Dinopoulos lost track of the remaining Turkish aircraft and his flight leader. Both F-5 pilots therefore returned to base separately. Initially, Scamparthonus believed that Dinopoulos had been shot down, but then upon seeing the empty missile rails, judged that he knew what had happened. Captain Onur got lost after the engagement as the inertial navigation system gyro was malfunctioning. Thinking he was heading east, he was in fact heading west towards Athens. By the time he realized he was past bingo fuel, it was too late. He attempted to land on an unfinished highway near Soke in Turkey. In doing so, the landing gear collapsed and the aircraft was damaged. In the Greek account, Captain Onur was killed. In the Turkish, he survived with minor injuries. In summary, then, in the Greek account of things, one F-102 was shot down with a Sidewinder, and another crashed as a result of fuel deprivation caused by engaging the Greek fighters. Both Turkish pilots died. In the Turkish account, one F-5 was shot down with a Falcon, and one F-102 was extensively damaged while attempting to land on a highway. Both of its pilots survived, and the aircraft was repaired. I must stress at this point that I have no axe to grind here. I just want to understand this engagement as best I can, given that the Greek and Turkish accounts are quite different in terms of outcome. Starting with the physical evidence, Scamparthonus obviously survived as he became a brigadier general and he was interviewed for the most extensive account of this action in May 2001 or thereabouts. Dinopoulos' career has proved impossible to follow after his role in the incident. A possible reason is that I've seen suggestions that the two pilots were put on a charge for opening fire during the engagement without authorization. The Greek military was somewhat chaotic at the time and the junta was in the process of collapsing. The charges certainly don't seem to have impeded Scamparthonus' career. Captain Onur retired from the Turkish Air Force as a lieutenant colonel and he went on to fly for Turkish Airlines. He died from cancer in 2015. Lieutenant Colonel Sain retired a full colonel, but I've not been able to find out what he did after retirement or whether he's still alive. Neither Air Force has ever officially made a statement about the incident. Both countries were obliged to inform NATO of aircraft losses, and indeed Turkey did report the loss of one F-102 in and around the 22nd. It was destroyed in a landing accident on the 23rd of July, killing a Major Sinar. Sain and Onur attended their friend's funeral, which is quite hard to do if you're dead. The Hellenic Air Force lost an F-5A on the 22nd of July. Second Lieutenant Demetrius of the 343rd Fighter Interceptor Squadron crashed during an attempted emergency landing at Tanagra Air Force Base. That aircraft was 64-13361, and it was reported to NATO. No gun camera footage has ever been released by either side. No photos of wreckage of an F-102 or an F-5 washed up around the shores of the Aegean has surfaced, as far as I can tell. There's been no mention of a search and rescue effort in that area either. An F-4 crew on a ferry flight further south over the Aegean heard Scamparthonus talking to Joker during the dogfight, validating the nature of the initial portion of the engagement. Incidentally, the pilot of that aircraft had actually trained Dinopoulos when he was himself an instructor in the F5 unit. But Dinopoulos had no radio, and he couldn't make a Fox 1 or equivalent call. Skamparthonis didn't see the missile impact, as he had lost track of the F-102s in the closing stages of the engagement. A pair of Turkish fighters that took over from Sain and Anur in looking after the Albatross confirmed that the dogfight occurred and they heard the missile launch call. Apparently, 2 Turkish radar stations also monitored the engagement. Inevitably, the Turkish accounts of those say that they watched a Greek F-5 being shot down on the radar, but given the range, a diving aircraft disappearing from a radar scope is not conclusive evidence. So that leaves Skamparthonis' account of the action. What people recall seeing in moments of stress don't necessarily fully represent reality. Indeed, in the initial telling of the story in the Greek magazine Cockpit, Skamparthonis got the date wrong, saying that the incident happened on the 21st of July, not the 22nd. It's also important to say that the crucial part of the story, that Dinopoulos shot down the F-102 flight leader, is second-hand. There's one final piece of evidence that I consider useful. It concerns F-102 tactics. On the 28th of July 1974, a NATO radar station reported a dogfight between a single Turkish F-5 and a pair of Greek F-102s. Remember that both sides flew the same types. In this engagement, the Turkish pilot reported that one of the F-102s opened its weapons bay doors without launching a missile in an attempt to scare him off. This element of the report is quite matter of fact. Greek and Turkish squadrons practiced together under the NATO umbrella, which makes me wonder whether this kind of posturing was a common deuce tactic to unnerve an opponent or to indicate that the F-102 had won a semi-friendly tussle by getting a lock on. So piecing together all the bits of evidence, what I think happens is as follows. Skamparthonis breaks hard left into the Turkish fighters, which follow him into his turn, getting into his rear quarter after 2 or 3 circles. Because of the F-102's prominent cockpit frame, they fail to spot Dinopoulos, who is above and in trail of Skamparthonis. Since the Turkish pilots are under rules of engagement that prevent them firing first, one of them flips the weapon bay doors open to try and scare the F-5 away. Seeing the doors open, Dinopoulos mistakenly believes that a missile has been launched or is about to be. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and imagine that he is also obeying the rules of engagement and he has his master arm set off. He flips it on, but either because of inexperience with the Sidewinder or overexcitement, he launches the first missile without a tone. The Turkish flight sees the missile trail. Colonel Sain immediately dives to separate. Anur either has a missile lock or he just fires a missile unguided, before he too takes evasive action. One source I read had it that this was an aim for a Falcon. Most think it was a D. If it were an A, then it's the semi-active radar homing version of the missile, and it would have lost lock if the Deuce had to turn away. Dinopoulos then gets a tone and launches his second missile, but he's above an accelerating target and the missile fails to guide as the Deuces vanish into the clouds. Having read hundreds of accounts of similar engagements, it is very common for pilots during the stress of a dogfight to misinterpret things like afterburners turning on or engine smoke trails for explosions or destroyed aircraft. Aviators report their enemy diving away in flames, but in fact they return to base with minor or no damage. The human mind is designed to look for patterns. Human memory is also fallible. Only about 1 in 3 claimed kills ultimately turn out to be valid. The raw facts are that the missiles being used in this engagement demonstrably have a very low probability of kill, about 9% for the Falcon and about 13% from the AIM-9B. It also seems that all of the aviators survived and none of the aircraft alleged to be in the engagement were reported as lost to NATO. Notably, Turkey has eventually admitted the loss of aircraft in clashes with Iraq and the Soviet Union, and there have been public incidents with Greece. So my conclusion from the available evidence is that this brief dogfight ended without loss on either side. I'm sure that's going to be a popular opinion.